Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. My name is Cathal. I'm the CTO of AdaptiveMobile Security, and today I'm talking about a presentation entitled STK AOK Mobile Messaging Attacks on Vulnerable SIMs. This presentation is something of a follow-up presentation to a presentation we gave 2 years ago in VB 2019. In that presentation, we revealed the existence of what we call the Simjacker vulnerability. This is an exploit of SIM cards within mobile phones, which is being used by surveillance companies to track the location of tens of thousands of mobile phone users. The vulnerability itself was present in, we believe, several hundred million SIM cards, so it's quite a large and serious vulnerability which was discovered. For more information on that, you can clearly see it on our website at simjacker.com. But in our presentation today, we're trying to answer two separate but related questions. One of those was that Simjacker was actually using binary SMS, and in this presentation, we tried to see was there any other similarly vulnerable applications to binary SMS. And secondly, what we also try to answer is the reaction of the industry and the attackers to the actual revelation and the discovery of Simjacker. So before we go any further, it's time probably to talk a little bit about what is binary SMS. Well, first of all, binary SMS is probably used a lot more than you think. If we look at it into when we did some analysis in three mobile operators, we could see that on the delivery side, which is from the messaging infrastructure to the handset, that quite a large but fairly regular percentage of traffic was actually of this type. So operator A to operator C is all roughly between 39 and 35% of traffic. A much smaller percentage of this traffic then is used for these messages which are sent to the actual SIM card or the UICC. So this varies between operators. Sometimes it's relatively high, around 9%, and sometimes it's quite low. So the overall usage of binary SMS is for many things. One of the most commonly used is for missed call notifications, but also be used for changing roaming settings. And these messages which are going to the SIM card, these can change the settings on the actual SIM card. It's quite difficult, in fact, sometimes to actually identify all the different types of binary SMS. There's three parameters which we use within the actual message headers to identify binary SMS. Those are the PID, DCS, and the user data header. By the way, for more information on this and for any other parts of my presentation, please see the paper which gets released at the same time of VB 2021. So those are the traditional good uses of binary SMS, but it's very fair to say that binary SMS has also been misused over the last really 20 years. And some people will be surprised by how often it is misused and how often new vulnerabilities actually arise. In the last 20 years, there have been at least 28 known separate vulnerabilities, and they actually occur fairly regularly over time. One interesting thing about this is when we go to investigate this, is that the general complexities of these attacks or these vulnerabilities have been increasing over time. The initial vulnerabilities, as I show here, were actually quite simple, mostly denial of service. But the more recent ones have been used to extract information, such as the Simjacker attack, or to do other types of attacks. You can also see in some of these names that it's anytime there's publicity about this, is always sometimes scary names, such as the very first one, which we can look at now with a wry smile, but killer text message found. But we also have names like curse of silence, SMS of death, monkey calendar, and so on. The vast majorities of these, like I've said, have targeted the device or the OS, but recently, as with the case of Simjacker and also a related attack called Wib attack, 25% of them, 1/4, have targeted the SIM card itself. So talking about those SIM card destined SMS, we have to ask ourselves, when actually should we worry about these? The thing with Simjacker plus other types of vulnerabilities like Wib attack is how they worked is they use this binary SMS that was directed to a specific vulnerable SIM card application. And how they know what SIM card application to send it to is defined by the tar value. So the tar value is something which is encoded in a part of the message called the command header, which is 2 or 3 layers within the actual SMS header of the packet. So here you can see the tar header, and actually when it came to SAP browser, which is what the Simjacker attack exploited, there was 2 separate different tar values. However, while this may identify the actual vulnerable SIM card application, this isn't really the parameter that we worry about. The parameter that we worry about to see if this actual SIM card application is vulnerable or not is the SPI value. So And in particular, what we look for is the leftmost 5 bits of this value. If this is set to 0, there's essentially no security. And what that means is that any text message from any source which is received by the SIM card application, if the SIM card application is expecting these values to be set to 0, then it will accept this message from any source. And the ambiguous setting of this in the SAP browser specification was actually the key cause of the Simjacker vulnerability. Essentially, the SAP browser specification did not specify exactly what to set this SPI value to. And as a result, all the implementations which went into all the SIM cards around the world, in the vast majority of cases, did not expect any security to be set, so they accepted commands from any source. So what we did, and a key part of this research, is we looked to see was there more of these vulnerable SIM card applications. Essentially, we looked to see was there traffic that was being sent to SIM cards with this SPI value, or the leftmost 5 bits of it, set to 0. This was an indication that operators were sending traffic of this type to SIM cards and they were expecting it to be probably answered. And it would also indicate that this SIM card application would then, in theory, accept these commands from any source. So what did we find? Well, if we took an overall viewpoint of all the SIM card applications, the ones that we have talked about in the past was that the vast majority of these vulnerable SIM card applications, which we could detect from message and traffic, at least 3/4 of them were SAT and 11% of them were from the web browser. But there was a small but consistent percentage of traffic which originated from other SIM card applications. Now, this is made up of a lot of different types of SIM card applications. In fact, there was over 30 unique TAR values. Now, if you remember what I said TAR was, it actually stands for Toolkit Application Reference. This is the identifier of the SIM card application itself. But there was over 30 different ones. If you're wondering where this traffic comes from, this is traffic which we took from customer operators, and how we determined the total global view of it is we took this traffic from global inbound roamers. So we could actually look as part of our investigation to see what TAR values were being sent messages from. And using these types of methods, we can build up a view of globally vulnerable SIM card applications. So when we actually went and investigated these in detail, we can see some interesting geographic allocations of these. So the vast majority of these TARs were in places like South America, parts of Africa, Eastern Europe, Russia, and a few parts of Asia. We detected that these SIM card applications were active in roughly about 50 operators in 39 different countries. Now, the colors here themselves don't actually represent the scale or the usage of these TAR values. The colors actually represent the number of unique TARs in those countries. So that's why Russia 6 is that we discovered that there was 6 different unique TAR values which had 0 security set. For the actual prevalence and for the actual usage of these SIM card applications, there's more information on our paper. But in general, we found that they weren't highly used. Unlike this, that's why the percentage volumes were much less than, for example, the SAP browser or the web browser. However, it doesn't matter how large they're used or how small they're used, there's still a question that we have to answer if they're actually vulnerable, because in this particular case, attackers could actually exploit them. So then we had to do some analysis to see, were these SIM card applications actually vulnerable? And this is a really difficult question to answer. In our research, we didn't have time to reverse engineer the protocol format of 30 different SIM card applications. This would have taken several months. So instead, what we did as a sort of a quick but reasonably effective method is we tried to graph out the entropy of these different applications. And the reasons we did this is the theory behind this is that then you could say that if a packet which is addressed to one of these TAR applications has got low entropy, and we used sample and Shannon entropy here in these two axes, then we could say that its structure was, not random but regular, and so then an attacker, if they knew how to encode the message, could reasonably recreate it. And to prove why this method we believe actually works, here we can see that the SAT and the WIB TAR values, taken as an average of their respective TARs, you can see that they're over towards the bottom left, or certainly on the left-hand side. But it's quite interesting if we look up here in the top right. Here we could see that some of these tar values, at least the round one, the round blue ones, they're all around got a high sample entropy and a high Shannon entropy. And you could say, well, how do you know? And we believe in this particular case that why they have a high entropy is that they have encryption in place. And you could say, well, how do I know that they have encryption in place? Well, to prove this, we actually took some tar values which we knew had encryption in place. So these had an SPI, which was the leftmost 5 digits weren't set to 0. They were actually where some of them were set to 1. But here we could actually see that the entropy of these tar values, which we know had encryption in place, also is in the top right-hand corner. So this allows us to confidently say that those tar values up there, even though they were sent messages with the SPI set to 0, they probably had some additional form of encryption in place, which meant then that these applications aren't vulnerable. The same can't be said for these applications, the remaining applications though, because the entropy of those seems to be considerably lower. It seems to be around the scale of applications that we know have been exploited, such as SAT and WIB. We can probably say that there is probably no encryption in place for these SIM card applications. And if you're to base the lack of encryption on vulnerability, that they are potentially vulnerable. So now that we're saying that these SIM card applications are potentially vulnerable, then we have a question about what could be achieved if you could actually access them and instruct them to do malicious operations. Well, from our investigation, as I explained, we didn't reverse engineer 30 applications, but what we could do is we could tell from the types of messages which were being sent and sometimes the responses and what was occurring, what actually they were being used for. So from our investigation, the majority of these applications were used simply for notifications or in some cases for context exchange. Generally, the scale of malicious activity you could do with these was you would expect to be relatively limited, although they could be exploited. There could be possibilities of putting malicious contacts onto a person's phone or to give them some notifications which they may not be expected or telling them to do something which, may not be desirable. However, there were some TARs, i.e. UICC applications, which have access to a lot more sensitive information. Those are primarily the TARs which start with 0xb. And in some of those cases, those could be, if they were used, and if an attacker was aware that they were made available, you could use them for location tracking because you would request the specific location from the SIM card. You could potentially extract information from the SIM card, such as IMSI. Certain cases, you potentially could extract the SIM key, and you could change things like the roaming settings. In those particular cases, those TARs, those 0xb ones, should always have their security set. So in those particular cases, it seems that possibly when we discussed with the operator, there may have been some changes or there may be some configuration irregularities which may have temporarily allowed some access. So when we add up all of these potentially, and when we try to make an estimation of how many subscribers were potentially vulnerable, which is a useful metric to see the total scale of the threat level, there's several different metrics that we could take. A very unrealistic but theoretical maximum number of vulnerable SIM cards will be around 700 million, 770 million. We don't think it's anything that high because in the vast majority of these cases, we believe that some of these SIM cards applications were only present on a subset of operators' traffic. A much more conservative estimate is probably only between 30 to 40 million SIM cards are potentially vulnerable. And it's very probably that much less than 100 million SIM cards are actually vulnerable. And like I said, the scale of the vulnerability varies. Here I'm saying any type of vulnerability. So this includes these applications which potentially which you could just potentially do malicious notifications or context exchange with. So any type of vulnerability is not good, but in general, the scale of these would not be the same level as the SAT browser or the WIB attack. But like I said, some of them had access to quite sensitive information. But the good thing about this though is that from our investigation over the last 6 months to a year, we don't see any of these applications being exploited. This is very, very different from the SAT browser, which we saw being exploited by a surveillance company. So this is very, very good news. And at the same time as well, we've also reached out and informed all the operators which we could identify about this. And in our paper as well, we also covered the different responses and our interactions with the operator to get them to make changes and to fix the SIM card settings or put in security if they weren't able to directly influence the SIM cards. So this is a relatively good case. We were able to identify extensively these SIM card applications. And like I said, it's also a relatively good case in that we didn't see any sign of exploitation. But it's a good time now, 2 years on, for us to possibly look back and take stock on some of the activity we reported on 2 years ago, because we can also see some of the differences that happened since then and now, and also the reason some of the decisions that we actually made at the time, because it actually makes for a good after action review. So when we communicated the Simjacker vulnerability in 2019, we had several issues in doing this. First of all, that this was a very, very obscure technology, the SAP browser technology, very obscure, but it actually had a wide access. It had complete access to a subset of the STK toolkit on the mobile SIM card. There was also issues as well that only mobile operators could mitigate the vulnerability. So there was very little that you or I could actually do about this other than possibly changing operator, which in some cases was pointless because every operator in certain countries actually use the technology, or at the very worst, or at the very best, the only possibility you could have is maybe just stop using your mobile phone, which wouldn't be realistic in many cases. We also had obviously a massive, massive issue that it wasn't just a theoretical vulnerability, it was also being actively exploited by a sophisticated surveillance company to track tens of thousands of people. So this wasn't an attack in theory, this was being used every single day. And there was also a scale. So unlike the previous SIM card applications, which we have talked about, which we've been monitoring for several months, a SAP browser was considerably different. It was much, much more wide scale. We saw at least 61 mobile operators, and it was heavily used in several of those 29 countries. In fact, heavily used in most of those countries. And the other issue that we had at the time is potentially unknown more operators, because the SAP browser functionality had been deployed in many operators, and in some cases they had stopped using it, but there was many residual SIM cards in those operators where it was still present. And because our observations were primarily from what we saw in active users being sent these messages, we didn't have a full idea of how many operators still had it resident on their SIM cards, but just dormant. So how we went about informing the industry is that we did it through the working group for the GSM community, which is called the GSM Association, through their coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. This is very effective, but it has certain gaps in that there are several hundred mobile operators in the world, and many of them, while they're all members of the GSM Association, many of them don't actively participate. And so even though some information may be shared, they don't actually see it. As well as that, there's also effectiveness of it. It's quite a new program. It's just getting started out. And in fact, the Simjacker vulnerability was the first one of a live vulnerability ever recorded and disclosed within the GSM Association. And also there was a question that we had of leakage. We were worried as well that some of this information would also make its way to attacker, which may make our job in actually blocking it slightly more harder. So we had a conundrum in how to make sure that all the vulnerabilities were made, all vulnerable operators were made aware of this vulnerability. So one particular approach that we took, and I know it's not everybody's favorite way of doing it, is we consider the idea of a branded vulnerability. And if people remember the symbol, some people think it is a really, interesting marketing event. Other people see it as pure marketing. Other people saw it as a good cybersecurity method. It's, of course, the Heartbeat vulnerability in 2014, quickly followed up by many, many other vulnerabilities. In fact, there's whole web pages that cover all the different logos about this. Branded vulnerabilities, obviously, if overused, cause problems, and I know certainly that many cybersecurity professionals would see them as not the best way of informing the industry. But you also have to consider that in certain circumstances, they do gain publicity, and they do also, the most important part of it, get the attention of those who maybe need to make changes and need to put in security in place. So the approach that we took, given the fairly unique set of circumstances in our mobile industry, was a sort of a three-stage approach. One is that for several months we informed the community as best as possible, both through the GSM Association CVD program and also direct contacts as well, reaching out to the operators that we could see were being effective, telling them that this technology is present on your SIM cards, it's being actively exploited, and you need to mitigate this. And a lot of technical information was given behind the scenes to these operators. However, that we did then decision on September the 12th, 2019, to do initial public notification with publicity and the brand to notify any unaware mobile operators. There was two parts of this, is that we gave the concepts, but we were careful not to give the full technical information. And the reason we didn't give the full technical information is that if a person understood exactly what was happening, it's actually relatively easy for them to recreate this if they have the skills in the GSM area. So we do not want to have a situation where we're giving away full technical information without being certain that every operator had a chance to actually mitigate and put in defenses before that actually happened. And what we did do as well in that public notification is that we pointed mobile operators to GSMA where there was full technical information available. And then, of course, then we presented information of Virus Bulletin 2019, and that was 4 weeks later. Now, it's fair to say that in the initial response to this, certainly there was some industry observers who said that either A, that they didn't believe that this was actually possible, or B, that this vulnerability we're talking about was simply a copy and paste of different vulnerabilities. And there was, including some interesting news articles with these different doubts about the Simjacker flaw. And this is what I mentioned about, this is why I've covered other problems at interim. This was something that could have happened, and we feared it could happen, and it did actually happen. So we then have to ask ourselves, was the method that we took the right approach? Was this method of giving some partial information with a brand and then pointing operators to the community and then giving the full information 4 weeks later, was this actually correct? Not least because, from our own perspective, seeing people, and I understand why, question the information release was interesting to say the least. But let's look at the stats and let's look at the figures. So here we can actually see this graph here represents the number of mobile operators that we could see using the SAP browser technology per day with security level set to 0. This is basically the number of unique operators per day which we could see were vulnerable. One interesting here, so here is on the 12th of September where we released our public information. And then on this other green dot, the 3rd of October, is when we give the technical information. So you can basically say that everything for those several months beforehand, in this period of time, we were telling mobile operators that the SAP browser is vulnerable. You need to make changes, either put protection in your network or either look to see how you can reconfigure your SIM cards. So even though there were several months of information that we were given to mobile operators up to the point where we released the public information, the really interesting part from our perspective is that for the next couple of weeks, there were several spikes. And these spikes, when we went to investigate and looked at, was a whole bunch of mobile operators that we hadn't seen being active before. And what we believe that they were doing is they started doing testing and then doing a level of basically reconfiguration of their SIM cards. And the fact is that this only happened after our public release of information. We would have expected this would have happened beforehand because we're sharing information. So what actually happened was we had been sharing information, but a whole bunch of operators hadn't actually received it or possibly not acted it, but that's quite unlikely in that time period. And they only took action on it when the Simjacker vulnerability was announced with the brands and so on. So at least from this perspective, and the fact is that we could see these spikes before the technical release, it showed that the system actually worked. The method we took actually worked. There's no guarantee that if we just giving out the information initially, that these operators wouldn't have been attacked in those couple of weeks previously. So this is quite interesting from our perspective. Another observation here, you can see the number of operators vulnerable after this point stays relatively static. And the reason why that is that the vast majority of mobile operators have actually built in defenses into their mobile network. They've persisted in using the SAP browser, which is a perfectly legitimate way of dealing with the vulnerability. But this spikes here were actually a bunch of operators who only occasionally use it. So they could make the effort to then detect it and then essentially disable it on their SIM cards. The vast majority of operators elsewhere around the world use it too much, so they put in defenses on the network side. So this is interesting to see the reaction from the mobile operator community, who tend to react towards the end or after public release. But it's actually quite different when we actually look at the company that are doing the attacks. There's actual surveillance companies, and we can also see changes in their reaction as well. So these whole set of colors is actually, each color represents a unique subscriber. So here what we have is at the top band and the bottom band, these are two mobile operators where we saw Simjacker activity happening. So you can see on the left-hand side for both many different colors, and each column is per day. And this is typical of how a surveillance company works. The vast majority of the time, they are tracking lots of different mobile subscribers. And this is what you could say, and from our investigation, this is a standard behavior from them. However, you can observe it on the right is very different. The richness of colors is completely gone. You normally see one or two different colors. And the key, and then we have to ask ourselves what actually happened. During this whole period of time, our work with mobile operators was essentially the same. We weren't making any changes. So this is all due to the surveillance company's decisions. And we can see some key changes. When we look here, this is actually the date when we released our public information. However, you can see that the actual change happened several days beforehand. So if the Simjacker attackers had made their decision to change their activity based on our public release, everything should have changed on the 12th, but it didn't. It changed several days beforehand. So as I mentioned earlier, one thing that we were interested in understanding was to see what level of essentially leakage of this information would have there been to these attackers. We must be realistic. There's roughly about 800 mobile operators in the world today, and there's many other people who work with them in conjunction with them. So we expected that sooner or later, because we had shared this information within the mobile community, that this information would leak out to these companies. And we were quite impressed that it wasn't until, up until quite near the very end when this information seems to have percolated through to them and they started making changes. So what they did was they started moving to a pure testing environment, and so as in order to change the scale and the type of their attacks. So you can see there's two different perspectives there. Mobile operators in certain circumstances wait till after public information, and in these attackers, in their changes, we could see a change before the public information was released. So we've also observed other changes as well from these SimJacker attackers. And one of the key methods that they've tried to do is evasion. So what they are trying to evade is any type of defenses that we put in with our customer mobile operators to block their SimJacker attacks. So if you recall from the presentations I gave 2 years ago, there's multiple different ways of injecting in the SimJacker attacks. You can do it via your mobile handset, you could do it via connection via SMPP, or you can do it via connection via SS7. And of course, once we and our customers put in blocks or firewalls to stop these messages, then these attacks often cease. But as I covered previously, these are professional surveillance companies. It is their job and is what they're being paid a lot of money to do, to track people on behalf of their customers. And they don't just think in terms of specifications or standards. They just think they think in the scale of their targets. They need to track these targets regardless of their technologies. So what we constantly have to keep an eye out for and look for is if they find new ways of injecting in their attacks. And as you can imagine, we've seen some interesting ways of that they've done this, and some of these are very interesting indeed. So one of the most interesting is the fact that we observed these SimJacker attacks use a different protocol. So what they actually use is they injected SMS over SIP message. So SIP is used for many things, used for voice or VoIP call and voice setup, but it's also used in some of the IMS protocols and VoLTE networks. And in this particular case, one of our custom operators, the attackers discovered that there was a means in which they could inject their attacks using SIP message. So I wish I could say this is the only one of these types of attacks. I mean, but we've seen multiple different types of variations, multiple different types of attempts to inject different types of attacks, and sometimes the different types of methods is really inventive. But this is one particularly interesting one that we observed. And when we do observe these different types of evasion techniques, there's always an inevitable period of time between when we detect them to when we go to essentially block and protect the subscribers. And those small periods of time when we can actually observe the attacks happening in their, as you could say, native environment, as opposed to a period where the attackers are actually trying to test against us, where those attacks aren't um, real of a you could say a normal environment. This allows us to make judgments on the scale of the attacks. So, and that's what this has done. So when we actually looked at those periods of time, those brief periods of time when we identify those gaps in them, we can see a large variety of different types of devices which were attempted to be tracked. So the largest type was obviously a smartphone, And actually, the large type of phone which is being tracked will be Apple phones of iPhones. Now, before you try to say anything like, oh, is Apple more vulnerable or Google or is Android better? It's not actually that. It's that the people using these attacks, these SimJacker attacks, are targeting a broad spectrum of essentially the Mexican market. And so these are more representative of the deployment or the types of devices in Mexico as opposed to device vulnerability. Any mobile device which has a SIM card in it with a SAP browser is potentially vulnerable in these cases. In fact, we uncovered some quite interesting devices being tracked, including a black phone from Solid Circle, and as well as that, we also noticed and detected some IoT type devices being tracked as well. So it's a whole range of different types of devices, but it really comes down to the SIM card as opposed to the actual device type. As well as that, these brief periods of time also allows us to make estimates of the scale of devices and estimates essentially the scale of number of people who would normally be tracked. So assuming a world where there was no protection in place, say this would be pre-2019, we would have estimated that there was roughly around 250, 260,000, 100,000 location lookups per year. And given the fact that some people are targeted multiple times, we estimated around 31,000 people, unique subscribers per year, were being targeted by the system. Those are huge numbers. And this is not just a system which is being used or was being used for, you could say targeted, tracking. This is being used to track tens of thousands of people in Mexico per year. And given the scale of this type of attacks, again, I have to say that these attackers are not going away. And from our perspective, this is a constant exercise to detect and block these. We believe that they have been um, quite consistent. They're certainly being quite determined over the last 2 years to try to make sure that their attacks get together. So from our perspective, it's a constant exercise to try to detect any potential holes or vulnerabilities that may be present and then block these. So I hope you found this presentation quick but useful. There's three main conclusions and takeaways I can take you from this. Binary SMS has been around for over 20 years. People forget that, and people, every time it comes up, people sometimes might assume that, oh, this is old technology, but it's going to continue to happen. Binary SMS is still going to be used in 5G. So this technology is not going away anytime soon. But there is work ongoing within the industry. Since the SimJacker vulnerability was released, there has been work behind the scenes within the GSM Association to help define and techniques and methods to block not only that, but all different types of binary SMS. So there is work ongoing and has happened in the background on this area. As part of this work, we undertook and we did identify these 30 potentially vulnerable SIM card applications. And like I said, thankfully, many of them, most of them don't seem to be the same, certainly not at the same scale, and don't seem to be exploited. But the potential vulnerability is present, so the mobile operators need to be aware of this and then need to focus on putting in security for these SIM card applications. And finally, as we show in certain circumstances, surveillance companies do react faster than mobile operators or a subset of mobile operators. And what I was saying is what we say with our customer operators is that, slow is fast and old is new. It's better to do this right and get this right. And because the actual attackers themselves, they don't think in the terms of one protocol or different protocol or IP versus mobile network. They think of terms of targets, and they will use whatever technology and whatever methods they can to get information on their targets. And so to stop that happening, threat intelligence is key. Knowing what types of attacks, knowing the capabilities of the mobile network, knowing what they've tried to do in the past, and understanding what they may try to do in the future is key then. These are not ordinary criminals. These are well-funded, technically very clever, technically very proficient individuals doing these types of attacks. Most of them, I would say, possibly also from a mobile background originally. So in the best case, to try to stop those, threat intelligence, intelligence, what's actually going on, experience, and security mindset is key to defeating these. So thank you very much for attending my presentation today. I hope you found it useful. It was very quick. Like I said, the paper is available on the VB 2021 website. I hope you find that useful. It's obviously much larger than this. And I'd like to thank all members of my team, and I wish you a very good day. Goodbye.